say is that I am presenting from Victoria, BC, in unceded Coast Salish territory, and I just wanted to start my presentation off by acknowledging that. And then I'll bring up the screen. All right, can you guys all see it to me? Can I get a thumbs up? Great, awesome. All right, so I'm going to talk about my residency research project today, which was the family experience of the Autism Spectrum Disorder Diagnostic Conference. And this was a qualitative meta-study, and I'm going to share our results, which are still somewhat preliminary, but we had enough that we felt comfortable sharing. So the objectives for the chat for us today are for listeners to understand what qualitative metasynthesis is as a study design, to appreciate common themes in the family diagnostic experience, and if you're a clinician, to reflect on your clinical practice. And I do have a few acknowledgements. So first off, the research was supported by Autism Edmonton and the Autism Research Center at the U of A. And secondly, my research was supported by quite a broad team. So Dr. Shannon Phelan is in the bottom right corner, and she is an academic occupational therapist that was working at the U of A when we started this project and has since moved on to Dalhousie University, and she's an expert in critical disability theory. And then Ms. Cassie Boyd is in the top left corner, and she is a PhD candidate student, and she and I worked very closely together on this project. Dr. Lonnie Zwangenbaum is also a developmental pediatrician and a clinical expert in autism spectrum disorder. And then Ms. Lisa Schoveld is an academic health sciences librarian who helped us with our search strategy. And she later on in the study is going to be a family member to enable some member checking as a parent who's gone through an autism diagnostic process with her child. So those are the acknowledgements for today. And just because I wasn't sure who the audience was in terms of the breadth of listeners, I thought I would start at the sort of bare bones clinical perspective of what is qualitative research. Because most clinicians, especially those within medicine, come with more of a quantitative research background. So the difference for qualitative research is that it aims to provide an in-depth understanding into human behavior, emotion, attitudes, and experiences. And importantly, it's not a single unified tradition, but what I think of it as is more of a big, messy, extended family of relationships and related approaches, but can have quite different philosophical frameworks within that family. Qualitative studies do typically share quite a few key ingredients or characteristics, though. So there's this naturalistic inquiry into the situation with more of an inductive reasoning process, so bottom up as opposed to top down. We rely as the researcher as an instrument of data collection, which is quite different from quantitative research. And typically we're emphasizing narrative or imagery or something as opposed to numbers, which quantitative research relies on. And I really like this little cartoon. I felt like it summed it up in general, the sort of feeling behind each type of research. Yeah, so we'll move right on. So our study design is a meta-synthesis. And so we pooled together qualitative research. And this pooling of qualitative research as a methodology really grew out of social work and nursing professions and academic schools of thought. And it happened in response to a growth of qualitative studies in the social sciences that were not being valued or utilized between clinical professions that had more of a quantitative slant, and so they weren't being incorporated into evidence-based practice. And so that was part of the original rationale for this area of method to sort of emerge. And I like this picture because it really shows that as a method, people have grabbed onto it and have really been really interested in it. So back in the mid-90s, there was 1 or 2 studies published that pooled together qualitative research. And now in 2012, when this study was published, there was almost 100 studies per year. And now 10 years later, even more. And with this interest in putting together qualitative research has come a really this huge proliferation of language used to describe pooling together qualitative research. So some people might call it a metasynthesis. Some people might call it a qualitative systematic review. Some people might call it a thematic or content synthesis. So there's a lot of different words that are used to describe this bringing together of many different qualitative studies. And for our purposes, we went with metasynthesis because we felt it was most in keeping with sort of the background we were each bringing. So this is defined as the bringing together and breaking down of findings, examining them, discovering what the essential features are, and then hopefully in some way combining them into a new transformed whole. So that is the goal and process of metasynthesis. And like a meta-analysis in a quantitative research background, there is valuation of being transparent and systematic. So quite systematic search strategies, typically predetermined inclusion criteria, and often a critical appraisal process of the articles as well, which are all the same approaches that you would see if you were to do a quantitative meta-analysis. And so I kind of like this picture again. I sort of made it to put it together in my mind of how the two pieces fit together. So people with a more clinical, especially medical background, are quite comfortable with meta-analysis, wherein you have a number of individual studies, study 1, 2, 3, 4 on the right here. They have individual data points denoted by these individual squares. And then all of that core data is combined and analyzed together to create a new product. And the exact same concept applies to a qualitative metasynthesis, where you take individual data, put it all together for the analysis process, and then look at something else that comes out of it. So that provides a little bit of background about the method and the study design that we used. So our research question was, what's the family experience of the Autism Spectrum Disorder Diagnostic Conference? And to sort of define that a little bit more, the diagnostic conference is that kind of hour or moment in time after the child has been referred for the assessment, has gone through the assessment, and now the clinicians are sharing information with the family about the diagnosis. And in qualitative research, we aim to have a theory that guides how we do analysis and often also informs study design. And we decided to just use a really broad critical theory, which focuses on unequal relations in power. And we felt that that was something we were all comfortable with, could agree on, with the fact that we all come with very different backgrounds, which was a real strength for our study in terms of looking at the material or the data from different perspectives. So then this is autism research round. So we all know that autism is incredibly prevalent, and there's relevance for ASD questions for that. Furthermore, because the prevalence has increased over time, more and more clinicians are making an ASD diagnosis and discussing it with families. And we have research from kind of about 5 to 10 years ago now that shows that Canadian physicians were not comfortable in general, pediatricians included, with communicating a diagnosis of autism to families. And that families are often dissatisfied with the whole diagnostic process, but also specifically how that information is conveyed to them. And part of that might be that the idea of giving or providing a life-changing diagnosis or breaking bad news, teaching in medical education, is quite limited, and it relies on sort of older frameworks, which are really sort of have this kind of negative lens that you're breaking bad news to someone that might not necessarily apply to sharing something like an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. So we felt that the question was quite relevant for these reasons. So we excluded a number of studies in our initial search strategy. We excluded the professional's perspective. We only cared about the child and family. We excluded all the quantitative components. And in studies where we could not be sure whose voice was being represented, we had to exclude those, as well as if there was a variety of children with different developmental diagnoses in the study, and we weren't able to pull out which children had an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, we excluded those studies as well. And so we had a really comprehensive search strategy that you would typically use for a meta-analysis and quantitative research. So all the health databases, multiple social science databases, and then the gray literature as well. And so in our article selection process, which was really created by Lisa, the medical librarian, we identified just about 1,300 articles, which we screened the title and abstracts of. We ended up reading almost 120 full texts, and of those we included 23. They met all of our criteria. And myself and Cassie were quite familiar with all 23 of those articles and did a lot of hands-on work with the data. So that's how we selected the studies for inclusion. And of those studies, only 2 of them were really specifically interested in our question. And many of the others were interested in the whole diagnostic journey process. And we were able to pull out pieces that were specific to our question, which was just that conference moment. The bulk of studies came from medical journals. There were a few studies that came from social studies journals or social sciences journals, but fewer of those. And most of them were North American or European, especially the United Kingdom. For the most part, participants were mothers. They tended to be highly educated, middle class, and Caucasian. And so definitely the participants, there's a huge variety of people that were really underrepresented. And interestingly, we didn't get any perspectives of children with autism themselves. So their voices didn't really come out, nor their siblings. So this is really parental experience, mostly mother. So then when we're pulling out data to actually do the qualitative analysis, we pull out the findings sections of all the included articles. And that's what we did our analysis of. And so this would be an example. So you don't necessarily need to read all of these quotes, but more we literally pulled out the finding sections, and that was our data to work with. So then Cassie and I were both independent coders, and we split the articles and we coded them by hand. And then we also coded them within Deduce software, which is just a software program that allows you to apply multiple codes to different qualitative data and also to manipulate the codes in different ways and visualize them in different ways. We went through a memoing process and a reflection process that was really guided by Dr. Phelan. We had regular meetings between both Cassie and myself, as well as more experienced researchers, Dr. Phelan and Dr. Zwagenbaum, to ensure that as we sort of built our coding matrix, which really means to distill a huge breadth of codes down to more key themes, that we were supported by people that were quite experienced in that process. And what that process really feels like as a clinician with a quantitative background is just having tons of data points, like this picture shows, and distilling them down into the really key features. And that process, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, is really described as sort of inductive or bottom up, but also spiral. So you're constantly sort of circling back on what you're doing. So kind of initially approach the data with a general theoretical framework and your own worldview, and you start coding and you start reflecting and you start memoing, and then you have a meeting, and then you revisit your codes, and then around and around and around you go until you arrive at a new understanding. And so for us, these are preliminary results, although we're quite happy with we're quite happy with these as our main themes that we've built out of a number of codes. And I'll take you through sort of the key findings for them. So 3 main themes arose from the data. So feeling or not feeling like an equal partner was a really common theme. This process of sort of taking it in, which is in the parents' words, something that they described. And then lastly, navigating emotions was a major theme that had already been previously identified in the literature, but was just so prominent that we really needed to include that as well. So for not feeling like an equal partner, this was something that came out across studies from different geographic regions, regardless of ethnic background. And there was a real sense that, particularly in the studies that followed parents through their whole diagnostic journey, or their diagnostic odyssey, as it's been called, that not feeling like an equal partner really starts almost at the very beginning. So first it's, do I know that something is wrong? And then it is, how do I get a referral? And then it's, I, as a parent, need to wait for this assessment process to start. I'm not in control. Now I've finally got the referral and I'm waiting for other people to contact me. And then there's a sense of not necessarily being aware of what the assessment process is going to be like. And so there's this huge lead up of not really feeling like an equal partner already in place by the time you get to the family conference where you actually share the diagnosis. And because of all of that, parents said things like they didn't challenge the doctor despite their own uncertainties or perhaps their own disagreements. And there was a real sensation that there was no room for discussion. This sense of not feeling like an equal partner, or the inequality between the clinician and the family, the parents, was also really reinforced by language use. So several studies talked about the fact that clinician language wasn't always family friendly. And so a few nice examples of that we read was one parent shared, it's not exactly layman's terms he comes out with. He doesn't always use what I'll call plain English. Another parent, a dad, said, you need some kind of glossary of abbreviations. I just felt completely clueless. And then, so the use of language was so important that really the use of strict clinical language really sort of maintains that power differential and reaffirms the family not necessarily feeling like an equal partner. And that really came through in the data. And then if we revisit the idea of a diagnostic odyssey or a really long journey, the person that decides when the assessment's over, when the family conference is over, that the relationship between the clinician and the family and the child with ASD is also over is typically the clinician. It could be the family sometimes, but what we more so heard or read in the data is that it is from the clinician. And that again is a sense of not feeling like an equal partner. So it's really through that whole process that comes out. Some parents did feel like an equal partner, and there were a few key things that sort of helped build that. So part of it was rapport and relationship building between the clinician and the family. And that was done by really asking and understanding the parents' view of their child and the parents' understanding of whether their child had features of autism spectrum disorder and why. So in this Jashar 2019 article, the parents shared that they asked our thoughts first. The clinicians asked the parents first, then they confirmed our thoughts. So the clinicians were able to feed back parental thoughts and really provide or support parent power in the situation by confirming what parents already believed. Similarly, if you look at the third quote, the one at the bottom, this is the same sort of concept where the parent says, I was made to feel that I was the expert on my child. And that's important because if you're belittled and made to feel that you don't know what you're talking about, then the relationship breaks down. So again, this also talks about the importance of rapport and relationship building and having a sense of sort of equality in that, and specifically really highlights the fact that there can be tension over who's the expert between the parent and the clinician. Also, feeling like an equal partner was sort of discussed in reference to who the people were present during the diagnostic conference. So if there was more people, for some families, that would made them feel less like an equal partner. And similarly, what the sort of atmosphere in the space was like. So if it was a physical space that they were more comfortable with and they had been to more times, then they may be more comfortable in it. So in this second quote here, a family describes it was a small setting. There was just the developmental pediatrician and the social worker who we already knew, which is important. So there was a relationship pre-existing. So that made it feel less formal. And this parent specifically said it certainly didn't feel like a bunch of doctors ganging up on parents. And they sort of allude to, obviously, that can be some people's experience in other circumstances. So that was our first main theme. So feeling or not feeling like an equal partner. The second theme was we're calling taking it in. And this is really, the majority of studies talk about the diagnostic conference. Parents are going through this really active process of learning and integration. So they have a pre-existing knowledge framework of who their child is, and often pre-existing understandings of what autism spectrum disorder is. And they're going through this like really active process of integrating new information about their child, and sometimes about what autism spectrum disorder is and means, all during this short, brief, intense time period where they're hearing the diagnosis. And so these authors, Abbott, Bernard, and Forge, they really comment on the fact that most families had some difficulty absorbing and collating the information given to them. And one parent really sort of astutely said, it's very difficult to assimilate a diagnosis of autism. So what it felt like the parents were describing was a very active process, not sort of a passive listening, but a real sort of intellectual and emotional integration of new information. One dad in the Potter study really gave a lovely, vivid image that for him, that process, the diagnosis for my child, was like an SLR camera lens coming into focus. Another parent's provided another sort of visual image that highlights that building process when they said, we understood that there was a reason that he interpreted information in a different way. It was like finding a missing piece of the puzzle. So with the puzzle, there's a building process and a new sort of integration of this information into this pre-existing framework. And then the last main theme was navigating emotional reactions. And there's such a breadth of emotional reaction. And to be honest, this area of the data from the original studies it did not give us the sort of rich, thick descriptions that we would have liked to be able to delve deeper into all the factors associated with emotional reactions. But certainly the fact that parents are navigating emotional reactions during this really intense, short-lived diagnostic interview is something that we still really needed to highlight as a main theme. So people describe it as really just this highly emotional, often profound moment. Parents often have vivid memories and are able to recall the experience in great detail. And some parents, even those that anticipate the diagnosis, say that even though they are not surprised, they may be stunned. And even if they are certain he had autism, it was still described as a highly emotional moment. Several parents also used quite descriptive language, which was almost violent sometimes. So, and this was common again across different geographic regions. So one dad in the Potter study said the diagnosis was a hammer blow. It was like being hit by a moving train. And another parent in the Abbott study said, I felt like I'd been punched in my stomach. And I just think that's so, it's just such vivid imagery to recall, especially if you're clinicians working with the family, that this moment can be so intense. Other parents' strong emotional reactions could be described as more sort of positive. So in this mother's experience, the doctor said, I thought he had Asperger's the first time I laid eyes on him, and the mother just thought, thank you, and felt very validated, because by this point I'd done enough reading that I felt like, yes, this is what's going on with him. This explains his behaviors. Other parents described a feeling of grief that onset right in the moment of sort of hearing the diagnosis, and a sense of loss of the child's future, and was losing aspects of being a parent. So those are the three key themes that our team has come up with, although they are still somewhat preliminary, and we're still sort of reviewing them and going through that iterative process. Implications for the research. that I wanted to discuss are, so firstly, for clinical practice on an individual level, I think that the more we know about parental experience, the better we can do individually in sort of understanding their needs and meeting a family where they're at. In terms of medical education, I think that in general medical education at an undergraduate level, and then even at a general pediatrics level, being able to have knowledge of neurodevelopmental diagnoses and frame them in a way that is not such a negative approach to sort of breaking bad news is really important, and research like this helps understand that. And then finally, what our study design provides is a really evidence-based synthesis of existing qualitative research, and our team's hoping that because it is such a study design that's well known to policymakers, clinicians, that it might be sort of a language that can be distilled to inform family-centered policies. So perhaps around the whole diagnostic journey, but especially around the moment of sharing the diagnosis. Sorry. And then these were our objectives for the talk today, which I hope that we've comfortably gone through. These are a number of the references, but not specific to the included studies. These are more general qualitative research references. And then I just wanted to thank you for the time that you gave me this morning, and thank my team again.